So we were talking about the differences between how the interest groups are organized, and we were talking about the difference in pluralistic society and corporatist society. So I was giving you the pros and cons of both corporatism and pluralism, and giving you an example. I was trying to ask you a question in a pluralistic society like us, how money or the member, the backing you have, as much more important than just otherwise not having those things. So I was asking, do you feel uh, more powerful if you have $100 million? I mean, when I say powerful, powerful politically, okay? And yes, you see, I think it's a naive to think that all groups are equal in pluralistic society. No, those groups that have certain amounts of money simply have more power. And what has happened over the time is that the balance of society between the power of workers versus the power of business, which was even in so-called, which was even um, some societies in 1950s and certainly in 1960s, has really gone the way of businesses. Again, if you want to see what that means, just look at the latest tax cut reforms policy that's been adopted. Who would they benefit more? You can see which groups are more powerful, at least in US politics. And because of that, trade unions are not listened to that much in the United States. Now, in other societies, say Western European societies, despite the fact that the trade unions are no longer economically powerful, they still represent a lot of people and they still are at the table. They still have power and they manage to keep the balance between the working class and business class, which we don't have in US, because basically business has won out, has won the battle. It's far more powerful and far more richer. Again, as I mentioned, what tends to happen in corporate society, corporatist system, is you cannot invite everyone to the table, and so rather than having individual business or an individual trade union, you generally see what we call peak organizations, or umbrella organizations, the the highest level of organization, not just the metal workers union, but general union that covers an entire country would be at the bargaining table, and this encourages you to organize along the lines of one peak organization and smaller organization underneath it, a kind of a pyramid or an umbrella where everybody is being underneath the umbrella. Now, to illustrate a little bit more how corporatism works, because I think pluralism we can understand pretty well coming from the American system, but to understand the corporatism little bit, let's better let's look at we have an example of Sweden. In Sweden, these key economic interest groups are: first, the trade union, the employers association, also known as the social partners. I don't mean just in Sweden, but the general term, if we are talking about this, and it's also hints to the fact that in those societies, sure, there may be some conflict of interest, but there is not a deep antagonism between the workers and their business the way they are in the United States, where the two have come to clash, and it's kind of perceived as either you helped one side or the other. Here in Sweden or Western European countries, the groups, the Greek organization, work together on a daily basis. They are much closer, and there was this idea that they are partnering together, working together, rather than simply just listening to government what it tells them. They would come up with the proposal first. uh, Listen, this is the training program that we talked about. The unions would be happy with this, the business would be happy with this, and is that the kind of government program that you are willing to push? They would ask the government, and a strong sense of what we say partnership. Let's look at Sweden in particular based on our reading. And one of the things that we see is, of course, in Sweden, very, very high rates of union membership. Whereas in US, maybe about 13% of labor force is unionized. In Sweden, it's about 80%. Maybe it's dipped a little bit now, but still in the upper 70s% of the labor force is organized in trade union. Big difference from the US, and they have one powerful peak organization. By the way, do any of you know the peak organization in United States? Uh, it's the AFL-CIO is the peak trade union organization in US. And again, if you couldn't come up with the name, I wouldn't blame you, because again, in the US, the political culture is that we don't focus much on the unions. They don't get much newspaper press. Most people are not the members of the union. On the other hand, in Sweden, it's very different. You have LO, Land Organization, and they are the peak organization at the top of the pyramid or umbrella, where you have 16 different trade unions that differ by types of profession that the people are in, and one for the government workers, one for the metal workers, and they're all just one single union. And they claim that they have 42% of entire Swedish workforce or members of the union are members of this peak organization. So the LO is very, very powerful, and it's clearly socially aligned to Social Democratic Party, SAP, in Sweden, one which at its core is workers' interest. We have seen that SAP parties tend to have as its core the workers' interest. However, over the time, it was seen that there was big difference maybe in the way blue collar workers work and white collar workers work. And white collar workers would be those who are in the service industry, and a lot of times in the service industry often been rewarded in a certain way for higher productivity. Let's say bus driver, uh, classic people who might be employed in blue collar job. A bus driver cannot create an incentive structure. You cannot create an incentive structure for bus drivers for them to do more work. You cannot say, um, school bus system, listen, you are doing a great job to the bus driver, but tell you what, we will give you 10% hike if you can find more kids on the street and just load them up into your bus, right? You cannot say that to the bus driver. They've got a defined set of tasks. They can't be um, doing more, they can't be doing less. However, if you're talking about somebody who are in something to do with sales, you certainly can do more or less work. You can be more productive or less productive. And what we see is that because of that, the white collar workers sometimes have different interests. They want to be paid differently. The school bus drivers might all be paid roughly the same, but for the white collar workers, say, the more productive, the more I get promotions, the more I rise within my organization. I want to be paid more. I don't want to be paid every single other bank workers who have been working for 3 years. I have done so well to make it to manager level within 3 years. I want to be paid more, and such and as such they are much more individualistic. And there are different trade unions that represent white collar jobs because their interests are so different and heterogeneous. They sometimes don't want to side with the Social Democratic Party, which are more about making sure everybody has a job, and they are not really pushing towards more productivity as such. So the they don't want to. So the white collar association is more of an individualized program that allowed to get more health care and things like that. So instead of setting more money for retirement, but to have more money for pension and those kind of things. So white collar workers are more interested in. So these are the things they would be interested in. So that union is not so loyal to SAP. Um, on the other side, we have employers also organizations, which is SAF, Svenska Arbetsgivareföreningen, and they are going to be the ones who want to be keeping wages low. Maybe they don't want to pay you overtime. They don't want to add any benefits that businesses have to provide, and all those kind of things going to be the interests of the employer side. And they want tax reforms in lower taxes. They want wage restraints, and as such, they don't align well with SAP parties, which are very much interested in workers' interests, but more within the SAF would be interested would be interested in business interest, especially the business that relied heavily on employees. So they tend to align with moderates, which are um, um, more of conservative in Sweden. And finally, for the completion's sake, we got SN, which is the Confederation of Enterprises, a kind of parallel organization to SAF, but these are all peak organization, and they are very powerful in Sweden because Sweden is very nicely organized in a corporatist model. So these groups are highly involved with the government, and every time government be passing policies, these groups are going to be at the table as well, providing a nice illustration of corporatism or neo-corporatism and the peak organization model. So that's in the nutshell the corporate model uh, with the example of Sweden.